I want to talk about Demeo Dungeons and Dragons Battlemarked, a game that I think has some really interesting ideas, but also some very clear limitations. At first glance, this game looks like a pretty exciting mix. You've got the tactical foundation of Demeo, mixed with the world lore and branding of Dungeons and Dragons. On paper, that sounds like a match that should work really well. And in a lot of ways, it does. But at the same time, this game also makes a few choices that I think created a little bit of a problem for resolution games. Especially if you are someone who goes into a D&D game expecting full freedom, deep character creation, and a lot of role-playing flexibility, that's where this game starts to feel a little bit restrictive. So what is Battlemarked in terms of the resolution games version and the addition of the Demeo system? Battlemark is not a traditional D&D game in the tabletop sense. It takes the Demeo style system, which is already more streamlined and tactical, and blended with D&D setting and identity. So it creates a disguise for the Demeo system. That means you are not building a character from the ground up the way you would in a normal tabletop campaign of Dungeons and Dragons. Instead, you're working with preset characters that already have their own class, their own traits, and their own role in the party. And that's important because right away it changes what kind of experience this is going to be for the player. This is not a make whatever hero you want kind of game. It's more of a structured tactical adventure. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics here. The biggest thing that stands out in Battlemark is the mechanics. The game uses a card-based system, and each character's abilities are tied to specific traits and class design. So instead of directly building stats the way you would in a tabletop D&D, as to say to pick the attributes for each character, the charisma, strength, intelligence, wisdom, the traditional ones, your character identity here is already defined for you. Now I can see the vision of resolution games by the fact that they created these in a light that you would take the setting of Dungeons and Dragons and put it in their own systems. I can see that when they decided to restrict the character creation, the customization itself is where they took the greatest of the risks in here. And you can see it on the numbers. If you go to SteamDB, you can see that it has sold approximately something around 53,000 copies. And if you see, you can attest that in the Steam store, at least on Steam, only 20% of the player base that bought the game have reached to campaign number 2. They took a great risk in this thing. Continuing here with the mechanics, that means that the fact that the character's identity is already defined for you, which is completely separated from the mindset of a D&D tabletop role-playing game, that means the game is really focused on how you use the tools you are given and not on how you build the character from scratch. I think that's one of the most interesting things about it, because it makes the game easier to learn in some ways, and adding it to the streamlined die that you have, in which you either do a critical, you either hit, or you could miss. So it's easy to learn. They have changed the D20 and they have placed their own system here. You didn't have to sit there and create a complex build from zero, but at the same time, it also removes a big part of what many people love about Dungeons and Dragons, which is character customization and the feeling of being a character of your own that you have been created with a biography created from scratch, if you know what I mean. The real strategy here is less about deep character building and more about positioning, timing in terms of the cards that you are given that have to do with the character skills or the character class. You need to understand how your party works together, how the cards interact in between them, and how to use each turn efficiently if you want to have at least a success in here. So let us dive a little bit more in character customization. This is where I think the game becomes controversial for D&D fans. Okay? The character customization is very limited. You can change cosmetic things like colors and appearance details. And here is where I say, okay, they have taken the fact that you can buy figurines and you can paint them. And here you have a very nice touch from the devs in that regard, but you are not really shaping the character in a deep way. And I think this is what makes this game being dropped for so many people. You can't freely assign attributes, you can't build a unique backstory through the system, and you can't really turn the character into whatever idea you have in your head. You are given a role, and that role is fixed. In here, you just have a generic character that it's called this and that's it. So if you're coming from a Dungeons and Dragons mindset, that can feel disappointing because one of the big appeals of D&D is that you create your own hero. You're not just playing a class, you're making a personality, a concept, and build a build that feels like you own the character. And this is with Battlemarked. I think it fails. Battlemarked trims that mindset. So while the game may work fine as a tactical system, I can totally see why hardcore D&D fans would say it doesn't fully capture the spirit of the tabletop role-playing game. So let's talk about the synergy and all of the cards, right? Party synergy. One thing I do think the game does well. Okay. Since you're working with 4 characters and each one has a specific role, the game encourages you to think about synergy. That means your team really matters. If you choose a party that works well together, the game feels smoother and more manageable. But if you start changing things around without understanding the system, which was basically what happened to me in my second campaign, I just decided, okay, I just played with Bolthrax, with the human ranger, and the tiefling. There was left just the gnome and the halfling, pretty much, and the dwarf. There were no more options for me, so I just decided to pick another tiefling, change the colors, and change a little bit of the attributes in terms of what the game already give you. And this is where everything went to hell, because you have to understand that you have to heed the actual recommendations of the game. That they are there for a reason. If you don't heed that recommendation, you are going to make the game harder for yourself. So you may feel tempted to experiment, of course, that was my own feeling. But if you don't understand how the classes support each other, the game will punish you, and I was frustrated about that, and I suffer a lot in the second campaign. And if you are in the middle of the road, you cannot go and take another change the characters. I think you can bring the characters from the previous the previous matches, but that doesn't make sense at the end of the day. So I had to adapt, and it cost me a lot of frustration. The good thing is that Battlemark rewards planning. It wants you to think like a tactical player, and rewards you positioning and analysis of the level in a very good and nice way. And this leads me to talk about the combat and strategy. That is the core of the game, basically. The battles are strategic, but I wouldn't call them extremely deep in that regard. A lot of the challenges comes down to positioning, as I mentioned before, using your abilities at the right time, which are the cards, and thinking ahead a few moves. Boss fights especially ask you to pay attention to where your character are standing and how the enemy patterns work. So the game is definitely not mindless. You do need to think. But at the same time, the strategy doesn't go super far beyond positioning and ability management. It's not the kind of game where you're constantly making highly complex tactical decisions, you know. It's more streamlined in that regard. That said, I do think there's satisfaction in beating a tough fight when everything clicks. And when you sit there, and I remember in the Frost Kip, I think it's called, in the second campaign, the last boss, not giving spoilers whatsoever, it did not clicked on me. I was not able to beat it after a lot of replays up until I sit there and start thinking in my positioning in where, what cards, what abilities were in the table, you know. When you use your cards correctly, set up a good formation, and win a battle that initially looked rough, the game feels rewarding. So using the environment is one of the more fun parts of the combat system here, of the combat mechanics. And something that is usually overlooked are the barrels, oil, water, gas, explosions. All of that matters more than you might expect. This is where the game gets especially satisfying because you can create a chain reaction and use the map itself as part of your strategy. That can be a huge help when you're fighting weaker enemies or trying to control a crowded battlefield, which you are going to face a lot because there's this thing that most people are complaining about, which is never-ending respawning of little and small creatures, which are not tough to beat, but in great numbers, they are completely insane. So I really like this part because it gives the fights some personality. It's not just about attacking directly. It's also about reading the field, reading the level, and taking advantage of whatever's around you. So the mechanics, pretty good, pretty nice. Implementation of explosive barrels. I don't know if this was taken from Demeo, from other titles from before. I never tried those. And now let's talk about the setting. Another thing Battlemarked gets right, for me, is the setting. The use of Forgotten Realms locations and D&D flavor environments gives the game a lot of charm. You get that classic fantasy feeling, the towns, the dungeons, traveling on the map, you know, it's not so difficult. It's just point and click. The familiar atmosphere of D&D lore, if you know, for example, for people who know the setting, that can be a big part of the appeal, in which you have the spine of the world, and the place where the legend of Drist, the drow, happens. Everything that happens in Forgotten Realms for Dritz the Warden, you know. And even if you don't know all the lore, the game still does a decent job of making the world feel alive. The campaign structure also helps in here. You move through different areas, encounter story moments, and build toward bigger fights. That pacing works pretty well. Even if the gameplay itself can feel somewhat limited at times, you can go into the narrative and have fun with that. I also want to say that the NPC side of the game is actually pretty interesting. This is where the dialogue comes in and how the narrative engine matches with everything here. So you can talk with different characters, get more context for the story, and sometimes unlock extra dialogue that helps flesh out the world. So it's not just like you just talk and you receive the mission and there you go. I like that because it gives the game a little more personality. It doesn't just throw you into battles and there you go. It gives you a chance to explore, listen, and learn more about the world that we are being thrown in. That said, the narrative is still fairly nice. You are not shaping the story in a major way because you cannot change it. It's not like it doesn't have branching elements, but you're mostly following the game's path and learning about its world as it goes, which is pretty nice. Then you can go and buy another stuff from Forgotten Realms, and you are now acquainted with that. So again, it's fun, but it's not truly open-ended like a D&D experience, of course. You have side quests. Side quests are probably one of the weaker parts for me, and that was in my experience. They are there and they add some extra content, but they don't feel especially deep. A lot of them can be completed pretty quickly, and once you have a pretty strong party, you are not going to struggle here. I remember that in the first campaign, it just took me like 30 minutes because I left them for the end. And I wouldn't say that they are bad. I also wouldn't say they are a major highlight, And in terms of the difficulty, I think here is where they nailed it. And I actually think that's one of its strengths. It's easy to get into, but it still gives you enough tactical depth to stay engaged in terms of cards and stuff. And you need to know the roles of the bosses, of course, your cards. What are your cards? And it feels rewarding if you manage to beat them. The first bosses are not so difficult, but when you reach to the second campaign, which I would recommend, because it is going to be a little bit difficult, to beat them, it feels rewarding. But you will get frustrated most of the time. So my final thoughts here is that I think that Demeo Dungeons Dragons Battlemarked is a game with a lot of good ideas, but it's restrictive, of course. Preset characters, shallow customization, lack of full creative freedom is not going to appeal to the D&D fans, So if you go in expecting a tactical fantasy game with D&D flavor, it's an amazing good time. You're going to have an amazing good time. But if you're expecting the freedom of tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, you're not going to be satisfied with this. At the end, I think that they opened the D&D door to all of the Demeo player base, especially if they were people that experienced this type of genre in the first time with Demeo, and then they have opened the door to Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, which I think this was exactly the point for this title. Sadly, I think that they have dropped all of the project, and the project is now, there's no news about it. I don't know, since March, I think, since the warlock character. But that's sad because I think that they did not approach this in a good way, because they sold it as a D&D experience 100%, and it is not that. It is a Demeo experience with the flavor of D&D. So sad that they are not continuing it. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's sayings that they have dropped everything, and we just got our 2 campaigns, the Icewind Dale, Spine of the World one, and the one in Neverwinter. So thank you for listening to this. This was my honest thoughts and honest opinion on Demeo Dungeons and Dragons Battlemarked. If you have something to say, leave a comment and let us talk.